Well, we're marking a very special anniversary today at Channel 8. This is the 30th birthday of our station. To help mark the occasion, researcher Marie Kirkin and reporter Ken Bennett have put together a special Action News flashback. Watch this.
It was a news event when this station first went on the air, Connecticut's first television outlet, reaching an estimated 10,000 receivers on Channel 6. 5 days after signing on, we began carrying Dumont Network highlights of the GOP National Convention in Philadelphia, our first coverage of a major news event. One regular feature of our early news and public affairs programs, the Man on the Street interviews. We talked to a lot of people, and fortunately, they were willing to talk to us. By the early 1950s, we were reaching 150,000 TV sets and providing statewide news coverage, thanks to a couple of ace photographers and some specially equipped station wagons. Jack Youngs, seen here in 1951, is still with us. Among his assignments in the 50s, football games at the Yale Bowl. He was also on assignment at countless crime scenes, including one where the bullets were flying overhead. Jack also covered the devastating floods of 1955, which took scores of lives and did millions of dollars damage. Our cameras were there when President Eisenhower surveyed our flood-ravaged state. Ike held a news conference at Bradley Field and called on Americans everywhere to contribute to the Red Cross and other agencies trying to aid the people and communities hit by the floodwaters. By the middle of the decade, we were broadcasting on Channel 8 instead of 6, and our news teams were almost everywhere getting black and white films of the people and events that shaped our world. For example, Vice President Richard Nixon, seen here on a visit to New Haven as he sought support for his first presidential bid. Our cameras were on hand in 1958 as the 15 bodies were removed from the scene of one of the state's worst tragedies, New Haven's Franklin Street fire. We covered the so-called Mad Dog Killers, Arthur Cullum and Joseph Taborski. They staged 8 holdups, killed 6 people. Cullum died of natural causes in prison. Taborski died in the electric chair. In 1959, we broke ground for a new home on College Street in New Haven, part of the Elm City's massive redevelopment program. The 60s were the age of redevelopment, and President John F. Kennedy praised New Haven's efforts along those lines at a 1962 ceremony at the White House. That marked the granting of millions of dollars in federal aid to the Elm City. Mayor Richard Lee and Health, Education, and Welfare Secretary Abraham Ribicoff were on hand for that occasion, along with Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. The 60s were also years of protest. Yale chaplain William Sloane Coffin was among the anti-war activists, some of whom tore up or burned their draft cards on the New Haven Green. But others accepted draft notices or enlisted to fight in Vietnam. Hundreds of Connecticut servicemen did not return from that war. Late in the decade, a protest against military recruiters at the University of Connecticut in Storrs turned into an ugly confrontation. On Moratorium Day in 1969, thousands marched in Hartford and New Haven, calling for an end to the war in Southeast Asia. There was growing turmoil in the inner cities as people demanded better living conditions and a share of the so-called Great Society. In 1969, just 3 years after Interstate 91 opened, fog shrouded part of that interstate highway in North Haven, and the result was a tangled mass of bodies and wrecked vehicles, the worst traffic accident in state history. But the 60s had their lighter moments, too. Remember Jack Youngs? He accepted an assignment to film actress Jane Mansfield on a publicity stop in Connecticut. That story helped round out one of our daily Newswire 8 broadcasts, anchored by the late Stelio Salmona. As the decade ended, so did the all-male undergraduate tradition at Yale as the co-ed class of 1973 entered the hallowed halls of Ivy in the fall of 1969. The anti-war movement carried over into the 70s. In 1970, President Richard Nixon returned to Connecticut to boost the candidacies of Congressman Thomas Meskill for governor and Congressman Lowell Weicker for senator. Nixon made stops in Hartford and Stamford before heading back to the White House. In 1971, our cameras were in Israel with correspondent George Thompson and photographer Jack Youngs doing reports on life over there, especially for former Connecticut residents. In June of '71, Black Panther Party Chairman Bobby Seale was released from custody when murder charges against him were dropped. That, after a lengthy trial, resulted in a hung jury. That was in connection with the Alex Rackley murder case, which drew national attention because of some claims that a black man, such as Seale, could not get a fair trial in America. Also in June of 1971, an Allegheny airliner crashed in East Haven. 28 people died. There were just 3 survivors. It was the worst air disaster in Connecticut history. 1971 was also the year we changed our call letters from WNHC-TV to WTNH-TV. In 1972, Connecticut's first legalized lottery got off the ground. In Waterbury, Senator Ted Kennedy campaigned for presidential candidate George McGovern. And in Hartford, Vice President Spiro Agnew praised some of the virtues of the Nixon administration. In 1973, New Britain's John Downey returned home after 20 years in a Chinese prison camp. That after the U.S. finally admitted Downey had been a CIA agent. In 73 and 74, we faced a gasoline shortage. At one point, we paid over $3.50 for a 5-pound bag of sugar. For some, horse meat became an alternative to high-priced beef. Women began joining police forces in greater numbers. In 1975, the sponge rubber plant in Shelton went up in flames. The FBI called it the biggest firebombing in history. One of the nation's most publicized murder trials centered on Peter Riley of Falls Village. He was charged with slaying his mother. Years later, the charges were dropped. The murder is still unsolved. In 1975, Ella Grasso took office as our governor, the first woman in America elected to such office without succeeding her husband. We won an Emmy nomination for our coverage of the December 1976 wreck of the Argo Merchant off Cape Cod, thanks in part to our Minicam videotape capabilities. We picked up another major award for our Minicam coverage of New York City's blackout in 1977. And our live action cameras covered the blizzard of '78. So there you have it. Highlights of our 30 years in the television news business. We've been at it longer than anyone else in southern New England, and we've learned a lot over the years, especially the fact that potentially you're never more than a moment away from your next breaking news story. So if you'll excuse me, I'd better get back to work. This is Ken Bennett, Action News.
What an amazing period of time, 30 years, from black and white film or holding up pictures for people to look at to mini cams. Wow, wonder what comes next. Well, for all of us, good night and better tomorrows.